Emma did not expect anything from that afternoon except silence, and that was exactly why it felt unsettling when the doorbell rang, sharp and sudden, cutting through the stillness of the house like a thought she had been avoiding. The house had become quiet over the years, not the peaceful kind, but the heavy kind that settles when conversations fade and routines replace connection, and as she opened the door, she was already carrying the weight of another long day alone. The man standing outside introduced himself as Daniel, an electrician sent to wire new security cameras, and his voice was calm, professional, and unhurried, which immediately contrasted with the rushed tone Emma had grown used to hearing from her husband, Mark. She stepped aside to let Daniel in, noticing small details without meaning to, the careful way he removed his shoes, the polite nod he gave, the way his eyes scanned the house with focus rather than judgment, and she told herself this was nothing, just a stranger doing his job. Mark had arranged the installation after another short argument about safety and responsibility, one of many discussions that never reached the deeper truths Emma felt but no longer spoke aloud. As Daniel unpacked his tools in the living room, the house seemed to react to his presence, as if the walls were waking up after a long sleep, and Emma stood nearby, unsure where to place herself, feeling both present and invisible at the same time. Daniel explained what he would be doing, using simple words and steady gestures, and Emma nodded even though she barely followed the technical details, her mind drifting instead to how long it had been since someone had explained anything to her without distraction. When Daniel moved toward the wall near the hallway, he misjudged the space slightly, brushing the sofa with his leg, and Emma noticed before he did, her body reacting faster than her thoughts, but she said nothing, choosing silence without fully understanding why. That moment passed quickly, barely noticeable, yet it left a quiet mark on her, like a skipped heartbeat, because she realized she had made a choice, small but deliberate, to stay still. Daniel adjusted his position and continued working, unaware, while Emma stood behind him, feeling an unfamiliar mix of tension and awareness that made her chest feel tight. The house smelled faintly of dust and old wood, sounds of tools clicking and wires shifting filling the space, and Emma felt herself becoming a witness to something she could not name, only sense. She remembered how Mark used to fill rooms with energy, how they once talked about everything from plans to fears, and how over time those conversations had shrunk into practical exchanges about schedules and bills, leaving the deeper parts of her untouched. Daniel asked a question about the wiring route, and Emma answered softly, surprised by how her voice sounded in the quiet, almost like she was afraid of disturbing something fragile. As he reached up to measure above the doorway, she watched the muscles in his arm tighten with effort, not with interest but with a strange recognition of effort itself, of someone fully present in a task, and that simple focus stirred something emotional in her. When he stepped back again, nearly repeating the earlier mistake, Emma felt the urge to speak rise sharply and then fade, held back by hesitation, by the fear that guiding him would mean acknowledging the closeness she was pretending not to notice. Daniel paused, sensing something without knowing what, and looked at her briefly, their eyes meeting in a way that felt longer than necessary but still proper, still safe, yet charged with something unspoken. In that look, Emma felt seen in a way that startled her, not because Daniel knew her, but because he noticed her presence fully, without rushing, without turning away. The moment passed as quickly as it came, Daniel returning to his work with a quiet apology to the room rather than to her, and Emma exhaled slowly, realizing she had been holding her breath. She told herself again that this was nothing, that attraction could exist without meaning, that awareness did not equal action, but the thought did little to calm the restless feeling spreading through her chest. The afternoon light shifted through the windows, casting longer shadows across the floor, and Emma felt time stretching, each minute heavier than the last, as if the house itself was listening. She wondered when her life had become a series of quiet moments she carried alone, moments that felt too small to mention but too heavy to ignore, and she felt a sudden ache, not for Daniel, but for the part of herself that had been waiting to be noticed. Daniel moved efficiently from room to room, and Emma followed at a polite distance, answering questions when needed, her mind racing ahead to places she did not want to visit but could not fully avoid. She thought of Mark at work, likely checking his phone, focused on deadlines and meetings, unaware of the emotional distance that had grown between them, a distance no security camera could measure. When Daniel paused to check his notes, Emma leaned against the wall, feeling the cool surface through her sleeve, grounding herself in the present, reminding herself of boundaries and promises. Yet even as she did, she could not ignore the truth settling quietly inside her. Something had shifted, not because of what happened, but because of what she felt capable of noticing again. The visit was still just beginning, the work unfinished, but Emma sensed that this ordinary afternoon had already crossed an invisible line, not an action, but an awareness, and she did not yet know what that awareness would demand of her. Daniel worked steadily, moving through the rooms with careful hands and quiet explanations, and Emma found herself following him at a polite distance, noticing how his focus on the wiring made every small movement deliberate, almost graceful, while her own thoughts raced ahead, filling the silence with memories and emotions she had tried to ignore for years. The house, usually so still, seemed alive with the sound of tools clicking and wires shifting, and Emma realized she was aware of every motion he made, the way he measured twice, adjusted a cable, stepped back, all with a calm precision that made the emptiness of her own home feel sharper, like the difference between sunlight and shadow in the corners of her life. She watched him reach above the hallway, misjudging the space again, and felt the familiar tension of wanting to speak, to guide, but holding back because something in her told her that silence could be its own confession, that letting him move wrong, letting herself not intervene, was more revealing than any words she could say. Daniel explained each step softly, asking questions about outlets and camera angles, and Emma answered, her voice steady but her mind spinning, realizing she had not felt this level of attention in years, not from Mark, not from anyone, and that realization made her heart both warm and heavy with longing. She remembered mornings filled with conversations that had now disappeared, the laughter, the quiet understanding, and the absence of those moments pressed against her chest like a weight she could not shake. As Daniel reached to adjust a wire, his shoulder brushed against the wall, and Emma noticed, instinctively stepping back, yet not saying anything, not warning him, because the restraint itself made her feel alive in a way that startled her, and she became hyper-aware of the air in the room, the faint hum of electricity, the muted light spilling through the windows, and the sound of her own breath mingling with the faint click of his tools. There was a strange intimacy in the shared quiet, in the pauses between explanations, where Emma felt seen without being spoken to, noticed in the smallest gestures, and it made her realize how long it had been since someone had treated her presence as important, rather than incidental, while Mark's attention had slowly shifted to work, obligations, screens, leaving her unnoticed and lonely in her own home. Daniel paused to check the plan again, and Emma caught the way his eyes lingered on the corner of the room before returning to the wiring, as if he were aware of the space not just physically but emotionally, and she felt a tug in her chest, an unfamiliar awareness of connection without words, a feeling that was tender, confusing, and magnetic all at once. She noticed the small things, the way his sleeves rolled up, the subtle shift of weight when he stepped back, the careful tilt of his head as he considered the camera placement, and felt a growing, unnameable tension in herself, a mix of admiration, attraction, and the quiet ache of years spent unnoticed. She realized that this was not just about the wiring or the work, but about being seen fully, moment by moment, and that realization brought both comfort and guilt in equal measure. When Daniel moved past her again, misjudging the space slightly, she felt the urge to speak rise and fall, her own hesitation reflecting the unspoken rules she had set for herself, and in that hesitation, she sensed the fragile line they were walking, the quiet intimacy of proximity, the emotional resonance of moments that could be dismissed as nothing but were secretly everything. Emma's thoughts drifted to Mark, to the routines and silences that had become normal, and she recognized the stark contrast. Daniel's presence illuminated the gaps she had grown used to, the spaces where attention and care should have been, and it made her pulse faster, her heart ache, and her mind spin with what-ifs she would not allow herself to voice. Daniel straightened, adjusted the cable, and moved on, unaware of the storm of awareness and longing he had left in his wake, while Emma stood still, absorbing the quiet energy of his presence, feeling a mix of longing, fear, and the gentle thrill of being noticed again, realizing that this ordinary task, wiring cameras, moving through rooms, had become a catalyst for emotions she had almost forgotten. The rain began to tap against the windows, adding rhythm to the stillness, and Emma felt each drop echo in her chest, a reminder of the vulnerability she carried and the fragile, unspoken connection forming in small gestures, glances, and silences. She knew that nothing had been said, that no promises had been made, yet the emotional weight of this afternoon was undeniable, filling her with a mixture of guilt, excitement, and a subtle, aching hope she had not dared to feel for years. As Daniel continued to work, focused and methodical, Emma's awareness deepened. Every misstep, every careful motion, every brief pause became charged with meaning, teaching her that intimacy could exist in quiet observation, that attraction was not always physical, and that the spaces left unspoken could be the most revealing of all. She realized that the house, with its empty rooms and humming walls, had become a stage for emotions she had suppressed, and that in witnessing Daniel, she was confronting both her loneliness and her desire to be truly seen, understood, and remembered, all without a single word crossing the boundaries they both maintained. And in that steady, unassuming afternoon, Emma understood that the moments of misjudged movement, of careful explanations, and of shared silence were reshaping something inside her, a tender, dangerous awareness that life could still surprise her, that attention and connection could arrive where least expected, and that the simple act of someone moving wrong in her home could awaken feelings she had long buried. Evening came faster than Emma expected, bringing with it a soft gray light that filtered through the windows and made every shadow longer, and Daniel worked steadily, his movements careful, precise, almost graceful, yet there was an ease to him that made the house feel different, warmer, more alive than it had in years. Emma stayed nearby, following his progress quietly, answering questions about outlets and placements, all while feeling her heart pick up in subtle rhythms she hadn't noticed in a long time, a mixture of curiosity, awareness, and a strange, gentle tension that kept her rooted yet restless. She watched him step around furniture, pause to check the wiring plan, adjust a cable with steady hands, and felt a quiet admiration for the way he approached tasks, not hurried, not distracted, fully present, and it made her reflect painfully on how absent Mark had become in her own life, absorbed in work, calls, and routines, leaving her unnoticed in the spaces that mattered most. When Daniel reached above a doorway again, Emma's chest tightened. He misjudged the distance slightly, and instinctively she wanted to warn him, to guide him, but instead she held her tongue, realizing that letting him move wrong, letting herself not intervene, was stirring something she had long suppressed, a dangerous, tender awareness that connected them silently in ways words could never explain. She noticed the small details, how his hair fell slightly across his forehead, the tilt of his head when he considered the wiring, the focus in his eyes, the subtle way he measured twice before committing to a step, and all of it seemed magnified by the quiet of the house, by the soft hum of electricity in the walls, and by her own heightened senses that had been dulled over years of routine and absence. Daniel paused, glanced toward her with a question in his eyes, something unspoken that wasn't about the wiring but about the space, the room, the moment, and Emma felt a pull in her chest, a mix of longing and fear, because she understood too well that the attention she craved wasn't coming from Mark, and that a connection, however fleeting or innocent, could feel like both danger and relief at the same time. The air between them became charged in subtle ways, the brush of hands near a cable, the shared glance when he adjusted a wire, the soft tone of his voice explaining the next step, and Emma realized that emotional closeness didn't always need physicality, that it could exist in small gestures, in silences, in the spaces where nothing overtly happened, and yet everything shifted inside her. Rain began tapping lightly against the windows, adding rhythm to the moment, and Emma felt each drop echo in her chest, a reminder of vulnerability, of hope, of feelings she had denied herself for years, while Daniel worked as if the house itself were alive, responding to his care, his focus, his quiet presence, and she was caught between wanting to speak and wanting to stay still, to preserve the fragile tension that had grown without words. When Daniel straightened, packing away a tool he had almost dropped, their hands brushed, and it was brief, polite, entirely unremarkable to an outsider, yet to Emma, it was electric, a reminder of how much attention, even the smallest, could awaken something long dormant, a mixture of desire, curiosity, and the ache of being truly noticed. She thought of Mark arriving home soon, unaware of the emotional currents that had shifted in the house, unaware that a simple wiring job had become a mirror reflecting everything he no longer gave her, attention, presence, understanding, recognition, and Emma felt a pang of guilt mixed with longing because she was both aware of the danger of these feelings and incapable of stopping them. Daniel checked the cameras, moved cords into place, adjusted angles, all with methodical care, and Emma felt a growing awareness of proximity, of shared space, of emotional closeness that existed without words, and she realized that attraction, connection, even intimacy, could thrive in silence, in observation, in fleeting moments that seemed ordinary but carried hidden weight. Each glance, each pause, each careful motion was layered with meaning she could barely define, and she found herself remembering times she had once felt alive, vibrant, recognized, while simultaneously mourning the years where routine and absence had replaced that energy. When Daniel asked if she wanted water, the offer was simple, polite, and normal, yet the brief exchange of hands and the way their eyes met held an intimacy that startled her, because it was so subtle, so human, so unassuming, and yet it made her acutely aware of what she had been missing, of the emotional starvation she hadn't fully acknowledged. She felt the warmth of his presence lingering even as he moved to continue his work, and every small action, lifting a cable, checking measurements, pausing to think, became magnified in her awareness, teaching her that connection was not only about conversation or physical touch, but about the shared attention and recognition that rarely occurred in her current life. The soft gray light shifted, shadows moved, and Emma realized that her heart was responding to something innocent yet profound. A quiet bond formed in the span of a few hours, and that bond was making her see herself, her marriage, and her own desires in a new light, vulnerable, honest, and quietly intense. As Daniel worked methodically, explaining minor details, making small adjustments, and moving carefully around the house, Emma felt a dangerous, tender pull, an awakening she had not anticipated, and she knew that what she felt was not fleeting, not superficial, but real in its emotional weight, even if it existed only in subtle glances and the shared, unspoken rhythm of two people in the same space. She acknowledged, quietly, that nothing had passed beyond polite conversation, that nothing had crossed any boundaries, yet her emotions had shifted, and that was enough to make her heart race, her thoughts spiral, and her mind replay every gesture, every glance, every pause, over and over again, noticing how something as simple as working together in a home could stir the deepest, most neglected parts of her soul. When Daniel finally took a moment to step back, wiping his hands on a cloth, Emma realized the house felt different, almost like it had expanded in the hours he was there, and she felt a mixture of relief, longing, and fear, knowing that these feelings were hers alone to manage, unshared and unacknowledged, while the quiet hum of the wiring, the tapping rain, and the fading light seemed to mark the end of a chapter she wasn't ready to close, and yet could not pause, because life moved on, and the emotional current between them would linger, quiet but undeniable, shaping her thoughts, her awareness, and the fragile, electric tension that had quietly blossomed in her heart. Night had fallen, and the house felt heavier now, wrapped in quiet shadows that seemed to echo the tension Emma carried inside her, as if every corner remembered Daniel's presence and every surface held the subtle energy of the afternoon. She stood in the living room, looking at the new wiring, the carefully installed cameras, and felt a strange mixture of relief, longing, and unease, knowing that the work done was perfect, yet the emotional imprint left behind was anything but ordinary. When Mark finally returned, late as always, he moved through the house with his usual distracted energy, checking his phone, tossing a coat over a chair, unaware of the shift that had occurred, and Emma answered his casual questions with a soft yes, everything's fine, though her mind was spinning, replaying every glance, every brush of hands, every silent pause she had shared with Daniel, all the subtle intimacy that had grown between them in hours of unspoken connection. She thought about the small gestures, the way Daniel had moved Ron just enough to make her aware of him, the way he had paused as if sensing her presence, the way his calm, focused attention had mirrored the attention she had not felt from Mark in years, and she realized that infidelity was not always about crossing physical boundaries, but about the emotional awakenings, the connections, and the attention that one craved but did not receive at home. Emma felt her chest tighten as she considered the loneliness that had built up over time, the quiet absence of conversation, the erosion of attention, and how Daniel, with his steady presence and gentle professionalism, had illuminated what had been missing, not through intention but simply by being fully present, noticing her, and sharing a moment that was fleeting yet charged with meaning. She wandered through the house, tracing the routes Daniel had walked, noticing how the spaces seemed subtly altered by his presence, and she felt a painful clarity. Her life, her marriage, her routine, had become a series of unnoticed moments, and the awareness she had gained from Daniel's visit had opened a door she could not close, a door to her own heart, to feelings she had long denied, and to a longing that was quiet but powerful. Every room reminded her of him: the living room where he had adjusted the wires too close to the sofa, the hallway where he had misjudged the doorway, the kitchen where their hands had brushed briefly over the edge of a countertop, and she realized that intimacy could exist in subtlety, in presence, in attention, even when nothing overtly romantic had occurred, and that realization both thrilled and terrified her. As she sat down, she thought of the tension that had been building in her chest all day, the mixture of longing and guilt, awareness and restraint, and understood that her emotions were valid, real, and complicated, yet completely silent, held inside her as if they belonged to no one but herself. Because Daniel had left, Mark was unaware, and she could not yet voice what she felt. The rain outside had intensified, tapping against the windows, filling the quiet with rhythm and echoing the pulse of her own heart, and Emma felt a strange sense of connection to the world beyond her walls, as if the storm outside mirrored the storm of feelings inside her, unpredictable, gentle, urgent, and impossible to ignore. She remembered Daniel's eyes, the brief moments when his glance lingered longer than politeness required, the subtle acknowledgement of her presence that had made her feel seen for the first time in years, and she realized that being noticed, fully and quietly, could awaken desires, regrets, hopes, and heartbreaks all at once, without a single word of confession or action. Emma thought about Mark, about the routines that had replaced conversations, about the small silences that had grown over years, and she felt both sadness and determination, knowing that she could not unsee what she had felt, could not erase the awareness Daniel had sparked, yet she also recognized that her life, her marriage, her choices, were still hers to navigate, complicated, imperfect, and deeply human. The house, wired and ordered, felt larger than before, yet simultaneously smaller, because every space carried the memory of attention she had longed for, and Emma understood that emotional intimacy, even when fleeting, could shape one's life quietly but permanently, like the subtle hum of electricity through the walls, unseen yet powerful. She reflected on the moments that had passed, the near touches, the exchanged glances, the silent understanding, and realized that these were markers of something profound, subtle awakenings that had nothing to do with betrayal in the physical sense, but everything to do with the heart noticing what it had been denied, the soul responding to acknowledgement, and the mind recognizing the gap between presence and absence. Emma felt a wave of conflicting emotions: guilt for feeling this connection, fear for the implications it might hold, longing for the tenderness she had experienced, and sadness for what had been missing for so long, all woven together into a complex awareness that left her both alive and unsettled. She walked slowly through the hallway, touching the walls Daniel had worked on, tracing the lines where wires now ran, and felt an emotional resonance she could not name, a mixture of awakening and melancholy, realization and yearning, that made her realize the house itself had become a witness to feelings she had not allowed herself to feel, a silent participant in the quiet drama of attention, recognition, and desire. Emma thought about the choices ahead, about conversations she might have to face, about the silence she could no longer fully inhabit, and she recognized that her emotional landscape had shifted irrevocably, not because of action, but because of attention, presence, and a few hours of shared space that revealed the cracks and gaps in her own life, the loneliness she had normalized, and the need for connection she could no longer ignore. She felt a stirring of hope, fragile but real, that perhaps acknowledgement, awareness, and emotional honesty could still exist in her life, even if complicated, and that even subtle interactions, like an electrician moving wrong in her home, noticing her without intention, could awaken feelings that were powerful, transformative, and deeply human. The house was silent again, the wiring complete, the lights dimmed, yet Emma's mind and heart were anything but quiet. She sat down, listening to the rain, to the hum of electricity, to the echoes of attention and presence, realizing that she had been changed in ways both gentle and irrevocable, that emotional awakenings could arrive unexpectedly, and that her life, her choices, and her heart would now be guided not only by routine, but by the awareness of what it felt like to be truly seen. Even for a brief, quiet moment.